right, welcome into the Five Guys and the Five Reasons YouTube channel. I'm Ethan Skolnick. You can follow me at Ethan J. Skolnick on Five Reasons Sports. I got Alex Donno. You can follow him at Alex Donno. He is comfortably in his home. I am on the run. I am on the lam because they're doing fire alarm drills in my building for 8 hours. And literally, Alex, it is the loudest fire alarm you've ever heard. So bad that they were kind enough to leave us earplugs at our doors.
Wow.
And I can tell you that as someone who has worn earplugs to sleep for the last 30 years, ever since I went to grad school in New York, they are not doing the trick. So I basically decided to come out here again on the lam somewhere in Flagler Village in Fort Lauderdale. But we appreciate everybody joining us today. We're going to tell you about one of our sponsors, and then we'll get to our topic. Our friends over at Better Edge. You can use the code 5RSN to play right away. This is where you can find the line that you want. We know that there's another sports book that's legal in the state of Florida. Well, you want their VIGs? You want their lines? Sure. If you want better lines with no VIG, this is where you go. Go to Better Edge, use the code 5RSN, get $20 to play right away with that code. We have a contest up there. Actually, there's still time to get in this one. This one doesn't cost anything. You just need to add your phone number. Just check the Five Reasons Twitter page for the round two of the NBA playoffs. Enter your phone number and finish in the top two, and you got a chance to win. And you get the added benefit of the fact that a couple of the series are in progress already. So that should help you try to beat me and some of the others who are on there. All right, so Alex, let's get to a team that's not playing in the playoffs. The Miami Heat, at least not anymore. And there's still fallout from yesterday. So it was around this time yesterday that a little before this, that Pat Riley finished up. And I can tell you that not only was the conversation out there on social media, but of course it was out there in NBA spaces too. And I don't mean Twitter spaces. I mean the NBA world. And there was a lot on my text line as well. And I'll just come to it with this. I don't think, based on my conversations, Alex, that Pat meant to come in quite so hot on Jimmy yesterday.
Oh.
I think there was definitely a message that he wanted to send. And maybe it wasn't just from him, that message, but I get a sense, again, a message was meant to be sent, but I don't know that he intended for the whole thing to feel like a Jimmy Butler press conference, and it did. And there was the one part about Tyler Hero being fragile, and then him kind of propping up Tyler after that. But beyond that, all of the takeaways were about availability or Jimmy, and then those two things were kind of linked together. And I'll just say, Alex, we've talked about the availability and how ridiculous we thought it was this year for the entire team. I'm glad that he's acknowledging that. Like, I was a little concerned that, like, letting the culture slip was going to include, okay, it's okay for guys to be playing 55, 60 games. Clearly, he feels even stronger about it than some of us did, which I guess shouldn't surprise based on his history. But I think, again, the tie to Jimmy and now the concern of Heat fans about where this goes, that's kind of the aftershock of the press conference.
Yeah, I think the one part where the choice of words was a little shocking to me, and I was entertained by it. But, when he mentioned somebody mentioned to Pat, actually, that, Jimmy had said that, if he was healthy, could have or would have beaten the Celtics. And then Pat's response was, well, when you're not on the court, keep your mouth shut, which I thought was like, okay, wow, those were very, very strong words, for the guy who's been the superstar on your team for the past 5 years. So I'm sure that that's got to be part of what you're talking about in Pat really not meaning to come in as strong as he did. But Ethan, that sort of thing's going to happen when you are as opinionated as a guy like Riley, and you're holding court for, I think it was about 47 minutes, which actually seems like that might have been on the shorter side compared to some of the postseason interviews he's done.
It's about the same. It's about the same. I kind of feel like it was more single theme this time than it's been in the past, but it was about the same. And I think you make a good point. Look, there's two things that I've heard that he was not really happy about with Jimmy. Okay. Two kind of peripheral things. One was the comments the other day. And I think that's just the buildup, Alex, of a season of unavailability, or at least not going sort of, balls to the wall when he was playing. And then it's like, okay, if I was playing, they'd all be in trouble. And I think that, to Pat, I think that goes against code. Yes. But the other thing I heard afterwards, and I think a lot of people owe my friend Mike Wallace an apology on this, because I even thought Mike was kind of out of line on it, because I didn't think he had a lot of ties to the Heat organization still, but he tweeted early in the season during in the media day about the whole emo Jimmy thing and how Riley would not go for that kind of thing, and I kind of blew that off. I heard that Pat was not happy about that either. So you kind of had bookend things here, kind of between emo Jimmy and this thing about and this boast, and I just think he wanted to get some of that stuff off his chest. But I think that the bigger thing, Alex, and I'll go back to you on this because we talked about the Jimmy extension last week. In the context of what he said yesterday, and the fact that we know Jimmy's going to ask for it on July 7th, and we know Pat's going to, at least from what he said publicly, is going to say, well, he's going to have some stipulations on that if he offers it at all. And I'll add something to this, some information that I've gotten in a second, but would you be more inclined to just give him the extension now based on what we heard yesterday?
Well, it definitely sounds like Riley is sending the message loud and clear, whether this is to establish some of his leverage through the media, that he's not just going to give out a free max extension if there isn't an expectation that Jimmy's going to play more, which is something that we've talked about, Ethan, is that you can't expect to be playing 55 or even 60. I mean, a lot of people were like, wow, Jimmy played in 60 games this year, as if that was some huge accomplishment, because he actually played 60 games out of 82 and then missed most of the postseason run as well. So I think definitely Riley's already laying it out there that he's not just going to hand out that extension without some conversations and without the expectation that Jimmy's going to play more, the way that you mentioned, Ethan, the last time around when Jimmy seeked an extension from the Heat. It was really no conversation at all. It was easier than Jimmy's people thought it would be. I don't think it's going to be easy this time around, but I definitely do have the expectation, based on what Riley said, that they do plan to keep a version of a Jimmy build moving forward, right? When you talk about Jimmy either being the 1A or possibly being the 1B, I did not, even with some of the strong words that Riley said about Jimmy, I didn't come away from that feeling like, yeah, this is the end of the Jimmy era, the way that going back to 10 years ago. I know a lot of people compare what Riley just said in 2024 to some of the things he said at the end of the LeBron Big Three build in 2014. I came away from that one 10 years ago thinking, man, I don't know if LeBron James is still going to be here. It sounds like Riley is setting the table for a divorce that's going to happen. I didn't feel like Riley is setting the table for a Jimmy divorce, even if ESPN thinks he's going back to Philly or whatever they're talking about now. I do feel like Jimmy is going to be part of this team's future. But another one of my big takeaways, Ethan, when we talk about this availability stuff is I think Riley, and I don't know if it's possible in this era of the NBA, would love to have just more team control over when a player plays versus when they don't or when they're maintained. Because when you bring up the influence that outside trainers and parties that are, not affiliated with the Heat organization, but maybe affiliated with the player, what sort of influence and control that outside forces have to do with whether a guy is going to suit up tonight or not. I think that's something Riley would like to combat a little bit. Whether or not he can do that, I'm not 100% sure. I'm sure that maybe depends on some language in the contract that the Players Association may or may not even, allow that sort of thing to be in a contract. But no, I didn't come away from that thinking we're moving on from Jimmy Butler. I do feel like there is going to be some version of a Jimmy build for the next few years.
Well, a couple things. One is we've discussed this idea of outside trainers and agent influence a lot on Five on the Floor and on Playback, and that's a losing battle for Pat. Like that ship has sailed. I knew that was a problem. It was a problem, honestly, when Dwayne had Tim Grover as his trainer during the Big Three era, and there were differences between Tim and the organization. And Dwayne ended up switching trainers. He switched to LeBron's trainer as his primary trainer down here, and he had him for the last term. But you're talking about someone in Tim Grover who was Kobe Bryant and Michael Jordan's trainer and had a relationship with the Heat through Dwayne as well, and that kind of soured, was my understanding, towards the end of it. And so I think that honestly, Pat is fighting a battle there that can't be won. Because like he's feeling the effects of the LeBron era, player empowerment stuff. And that is, he felt the effect of it, and he got the benefit of it in 2010. He felt the effect of it in 2014. And these are the after effects, that the players are going to get the trainers they want. The players are going to listen to their agents. It's very hard for a team to have much influence over that. I mean, there's not really contract language you can write that's going to keep all of that in line. And so I don't know that he can fix that. I do think this was a little bit of a shot across the bow to Jimmy. But here's the thing. I mean, we talk about the difference between 2014, and I got into this on 5 on the Floor. 2014, LeBron wasn't under contract. Okay. 2016, Dwayne wasn't under contract. Like, that's different than now. Jimmy's under contract. I mean, Jimmy's got another year and he's got a player option. So I think, and this is just my hunch on this, okay, but it's also from talking to some people, I'd say it's an educated hunch, that Pat feels he has a little bit more leverage now than maybe he had in those situations. The 2014 thing with LeBron was kind of a shot in the dark, and it ended up backfiring on him because LeBron didn't take it particularly well, but LeBron sort of had one foot out the door already. And essentially, Pat was daring him. He's saying, do you have the guts, or are you going to walk out the first open door? Well, LeBron ran out of it. Okay. Now, look, Jimmy can't just run out of it. Okay. There's some different approaches Jimmy can take on this. I'm going to put myself on the line here, and I'll talk about this more on 5 on the Floor, but for our listeners, I'll throw it out there. And I put this on Off the Floor today. I don't think there's any way that Jimmy sits out camp. Like, people who are concerned about what happened in Minnesota, he's not going to do that. Here's the basic scenario. Jimmy wants his money. Okay. People are talking a lot about he's not happy with the players around him or the build. It's not about that. Okay. My understanding is that Jimmy has only asked for 2 things personnel wise since he's come to Miami. He wanted them to re-sign PJ Tucker. They didn't. He wanted them to sign Kyle Lowry. They did against their reservations, and they gave him another year.
He owes us one for that.
Well, and they know that. His people around him know that. Like, they take responsibility for that.
Yeah.
And they thought the Kyle thing would work out better. But this is not like LeBron making suggestions or running the front office. My understanding is it's been those 2 things. And there was a legitimate reason not to re-sign PJ. They went with Caleb instead. We can argue about whether they could have gotten both. The organization will push back and say they couldn't have, when both kind of wanted to maximize what they could do at that point. So I don't think this is about the players around Jimmy. I know people are saying it's about not getting Dame and all that. He wants to be paid for lifting this franchise out of the muck. And that becomes a whole past performance type thing. And the sense is, okay, if he gets the money again, he'll figure it out. That's kind of the idea here. Okay. But he wants his money. Like, he's not going to accept, and people are talking about a 1-year extension. There's no such thing as a 1-year extension, because essentially all the 1-year extension would do is knock out the player option. I mean, and give him an extra $3 million. He'd rather have the player option. He'd rather have the flexibility. This is about a 2-year extension max, all of it. Or here's what I think would play out, or here's what I think they would say would play out. Okay. If they don't give it to him this summer, I think he'll play. I think he'll play his ass off. The Heat will get the benefit of that. And then I think he'll decline his player option and explore free agency and leave. So I'll just ask you that. Are you comfortable? Because that's the option nobody's talking about yesterday. And I actually think, based on my conversations yesterday, that is the most likely option if they don't give him the extension this year. So if you're Pat, do you call the bluff there? And are you okay with him leaving, getting one really good season out of him, and then leaving? Because to me, that's the poker game right now.
Yeah. I think I'd be okay with that. Like, when you bring that up, and I'm only saying this because by next offseason, Jimmy's going to be 35 years old.
Mm-hmm.
And he's had the issues with durability, and he's had some injury issues. I'm sure some of it is bad luck. Other is the mileage of the wear and tear that comes with having played for Tom Thibodeau so many times in his career and having had so many deep playoff runs. So if you're telling me in that scenario, Jimmy plays out a final year with motivation in Miami. And, I would have to hope that the best version of Jimmy would also lead to maybe another finals run, if I could be selfish here. But if you get the best version of Jimmy for another year, and then at 35, you have the opportunity for him to walk, recoup that salary cap space, and then just have to trust your management to try and build something in that wake of Jimmy's departure. Ethan, wouldn't that be, for a lot of people out there who are a little bit uncommittal on whether you want Jimmy long-term, like, wouldn't that be kind of a perfect scenario? I mean, is that
perfect for Pat and Mickey? I guess that's the question, because that's the dice roll you're doing here. I don't think they're risking him coming in as a malcontent. I know people go to the Minnesota thing. I don't really see that happening. I also don't think that they're going to be able to mandate or dictate a number of games. I appreciate the effort, honestly, because it was a big issue for all of us this season who watched this team, and it was for the fans as well. I don't know how you do that. They're going to argue, okay, that his absences this year were legitimate, with the exception of a handful, and I'm saying on one hand and not a full hand, of games he really didn't feel like playing. Okay, so what they're basically going to say on the other side to the Heat is, listen, he had personal issues which you excused him for. He had legitimate injury issues that we didn't want to get worse. So of the 22 games that he missed, 18 or 19 of them were that. Okay, maybe there were 3 or 4 games that Jimmy just didn't feel it that day and didn't play. Okay, what they would then say is, there's a lot of stars around the league who would do the same thing. Now, I don't think Pat Riley views it that way. I think Pat Riley views it, you play 82 unless there's a legitimate reason not to. But I'm just saying, like, that's going to be their approach to it. So if that's the case, how are you mandating it? What are you going to say to Jimmy? Like, do you want him to pretend an injury is worse so that that doesn't count as one of the days that he doesn't feel like playing? You know what I'm saying? Like, I think you're in a box there. I don't really know how I think you can do it with lesser players. I don't know how you do it with that kind of player. I just think that's hard. So I guess, and we'll talk about this more after the break, but I guess, again, it becomes, okay, what's the best of all scenarios? In your view, the best scenario may be him just going balls to the wall for a year. Basically him not seeming happy with the organization, but playing his ass off so that he can go get a 3-year contract somewhere else or something along those lines. Okay. And then you do it. But then I guess the question is, how are Heat fans going to feel if he has that balls to the wall season, carries them to the conference finals or the finals again, and that it's bye? You didn't give me the option. I mean, the Heat offer him a contract extension. He's like, why would I stay here? You didn't take care of me.
Well, and what you bring up there, Ethan, is why very few sports careers end on a high note. Like it usually, because, once you hit a high note with an older player, everyone wants to run it back for the most part.
Yep.
Right. It's why, because, you can imagine it's also a likely scenario that at 35, Jimmy goes balls to the wall and leaves Miami, and then he signs somewhere for 3 years and he's not the same player. Right now, in a scenario like that, you could say, you know what? Okay, we actually found the right time to end this. People always say that about the Pittsburgh Steelers organization, that they usually find the right time to part ways with a player, and they're usually right about the timeline. The Heat haven't always been right about those timelines on when the right time is to move on, but maybe in this case they might get that, and hopefully Heat fans would understand.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think that's the question. All right, we'll touch on this more after the break. We do want to mention another great sponsor, the 5 Reasons Sports Network. This one covers.
Hey, it's Ethan Skolnick for the 5 Reasons Sports Network. We've got a great new sponsor that fits with us perfectly. It's called jerseys305.com. That's jerseys305.com. This is your home for dead stock and vintage jerseys from the Heat, Panthers, Dolphins, Marlins, and the other local teams. Their mission was born from a passion for wearing jerseys of the old styles and the past players. Jerseys 305 aims to make every fan stand out from the crowd with unique pieces that you don't commonly see anymore. Maybe 10, 15, 20 years ago, but not today. And Jerseys 305 was created by the fans, for the fans. They're diehards just like you. In fact, they're probably listening to this episode right now. So check them out, Jerseys 305, their partnership with 5 Reasons Sports, celebrating with a 10% discount on the next purchase using the code 5 at checkout. Unlock your exclusive savings on the entire vintage collection.
All right, so let's get to this part of it now. If you are keeping Jimmy this year, let's say there's no extension, okay? They are up against the second apron. He said yesterday, Riley said, there were only a couple of players out there that it would be worth doing something like, I don't know his exact word, but something significant. Because he was basically saying, I'm not going to give up the farm for, minimal improvement. Okay. To me, that wipes out like the likes of like a Zach LaVine, maybe even like a DeMar DeRozan. Like that's not the category of player we're talking about here. To me, it's like 2 guys. Okay. And he said 2 guys. So I don't know if these are the 2 guys, but I know that they've obviously been interested in both these guys before. Kevin Durant and Donovan Mitchell. To me, those are the two names that they're needle movers where it may be worth it. And I can tell you, and I know Levitard's reported this, and I don't know the exact context he's reported it, but I do know that they were closer on Durant a couple of years ago than publicly made it out there. And that Pat was willing to do some significant things there to get Kevin Durant. And then it broke down, and there's a whole bunch of reasons why it may have broken down, and I'm going to wait on more sourcing to find out specifically, but I do know that they were in on KD, and there was a legitimate possibility. They went after KD in 2016. Of course, that was more open because that was free agency. And then Mitchell, they never really had the assets to get in play for Mitchell. Cleveland basically trumped New York, which had more assets to give than Miami did. I mean, if you don't get one of those two guys, Alex, what do you do? Because because they can't just run it back. I mean, it's odd, right? You can't just, like Brady said yesterday, they may run it back, but run it back harder. Like, just have the guys play more.
Right.
I don't think that's going to go over with the fans.
It shouldn't. I mean, fans have been bamboozled before, right? I mean, people were pretty excited when they ran it back with that team that went 41-41, but the back half of the season had that crazy that crazy run. Like, oh, look, it's going to be the second half of the season, not the first half of the season. You know, they ran it back with Deion Waiters and James Johnson. So I don't know, man. Fans have been fooled before. I think that it would be a hard sell for me, Ethan. I think it would be a hard sell for most 5 Reasons Sports viewers that you could just say, hey, we're essentially bringing you the same team that was a play-in, knocked out of the first round, but Jimmy was hurt. Scary Terry was hurt. Jimmy told you wouldn't have happened if he was healthy, right? This year we're running it back at full force, running it back harder. That's something you should put on a t-shirt, but I don't know how many people would buy that. I mean, there's a certain percentage of the fan base that's going to get pumped up and excited heading into a season, no matter what the offseason looked like. But Ethan, I've also been on Heat Twitter, or Heat X, I guess as we call it now, when free agency rolls around and you see other teams making signings and other teams making blockbuster trades, and you're not. I mean, I don't really blame the Heat organization for what happened with Dame last summer, but that was a very painful summer to see the way that it dragged out, only for him to wind up in Milwaukee, not Miami. Like, I don't want to go through stuff like that again. So it's a hard sell for most of the fan base, but I mean, is there a scenario where they can't really do much else than run it back?
I mean, it's a bad scenario for my downloads. I think there would be a lot of tune out if that's the case. I mean, this is kind of where it's at, and it's unfortunate because we always talk about sacrificing the third guy. I don't even know if Tyler's the third guy anymore, but I kind of feel like the only thing that will get the fan base back on board, if it's not getting a big star, is at least moving Tyler for parts that fit better. Like, to me, that's the only, and it's a shame because Tyler does work at his game. He still may be an ascending player, but his value has probably never been lower.
Fragile.
Well, yeah, and then it's like, well, first the fragile comment, but then he was one of the guys healthy for the first round series, right? But then he didn't play particularly well when sort of the bright lights were on him. And it was more than bright lights. It was also defensive coverages that were tuned to him. And I don't think that anybody was legitimately looking at Tyler as a number one option at this stage. But again, the question becomes then, okay, if he's not a number one option, you're paying him $25+ million a year, then he better be a really good fit as a number 3 option or a number 2 option, and that has not proven to be the case. And that's not all his fault. Some of it, again, is the 3 of them not getting on the floor together consistently, which is kind of what Pat was alluding to. But I don't know how you sell another season of internal development. Like, I think they're going to have a hard time with that, and I think it's starting to spread. Like, this is metastasizing now from just like Heat Twitter and like the most viral elements of it that just want to move at any time to it's getting into the more casual space now. Like, they're just going to give us the same team again next year. And I think that's going to be a hard sell for that building and a whole bunch of other things. A new scoreboard, while welcome,
you think about this phrase, Ethan, how depending on which sports fan base you're talking to, the phrase "run it back" can either be a very positive connotation, like, oh, we just won a Super Bowl, we just won an NBA title, let's run it back. Run it back is like a dirty phrase for Heat fans. It's something Heat fans never want to hear. Run it, unless it was 2014 before the big 3 broke up. Nobody
Yeah.
wants to hear the phrase "run it back." It gives us nightmares.
Well, I mean, running back a play-in team is not ideal. And running back two play-in teams, even if one of them did end up in the finals, like there's not the ambiguity of it anymore, right? Like last year was harder to evaluate afterwards because you're like, okay, were they the team we saw in the regular season, or were they the team they turned into in the playoffs? This year, the team they were in the regular season was probably going to be the team they were in the playoffs. I know that they'll say again, we didn't have Jimmy, but I still think it's a really difficult sell to say the team that lost all 10 games to the top 5 teams in the West and was 0-3 against the Celtics was suddenly going to go from 0-13 against that level of team to getting to a finals again. I just think that's a tough sell. So I think honestly that the most likely scenario here is probably that they do move Tyler, and they move Tyler for, again, not stars, but better parts. And by that, I mean like puzzle pieces that fit better, maybe for more size. It feels like Tyler and Duncan are going to get sacrificed here. And if that's the case, and again, that depends on Duncan's health, then the Heat need to come up with shooting. And that may be a whole nother conversation that we have next. But they may have to find a cheap shooter to kind of add to the mix here. But I just feel like there's going to be a recalibration. And I do not see Jimmy getting traded. And I do not necessarily see Jimmy getting extended. Although I think that the Heat might eventually, I don't want to say cave, but they might acquiesce on that. But I think the most likely scenario right now, based on the conversations that I had yesterday, and I'll talk about this more on 5 on the Floor, is that they don't extend him right away. They make it a prove it season. He either proves it or doesn't prove it, and then he walks. And that to me is where I think this is headed.
It was pretty telling when Riley was asked about Jimmy's extension. Like, he flat out said, "We don't have to decide this right now. We have a year." Like that.
Well, he also said something I don't believe, Alex. I mean, you think they haven't had internal discussions about it?
No, like sure, but I just think I think the fact that he's even talking about having that much time to deal with it, it tells you he's keeping that option on the table, in my opinion.
But I don't think Jimmy is. I agree with you. I think he is. I think he's making it clear he will. But I think Jimmy is basically like, okay, you pay me now or this is a lame duck season. And I don't even know that he would say it publicly. I just think that'll be the case. Again, if he ends up getting hurt again and he plays 45 games and they don't go anywhere, then, if he wants to opt out of his player option, probably Heat fans will be happy about that, right? Okay, let us move a different direction. It's almost like the better they play, this is like when good news is bad news for the stock market. Like, it's almost like the better that they play, the better the chance that he walks. And that's a trade-off that Heat fans might have to take. And I think that may be ultimately where it's headed. I guess the big takeaway from yesterday is there's really no easy path for this team right now. They have some assets. They still have good leadership, in my view. They still have some really good players at the top. But this is not like an easy fix. This is not like OKC with 15 first-round picks, okay, and 3 core young stars, and it's like everything looks positive right now. The Heat are on the back end of a cycle, it feels like, more than the front end of a cycle, and that's an uncomfortable place to be. Well, Alex, appreciate it. Thanks for joining me here, as always. We'll be back on Thursday. Probably going to talk some Panthers on Thursday. I do want to recommend everybody check out Playback today. Alex Baumgartner, Colby Guy, they know a lot about the Panthers. We're going to go through what happened last night because that was not pretty. 5-1 loss to Boston. We'll talk about that today at 6 o'clock on Playback. Thanks to our sponsors, jerseys305.com and betteredge.com. Use code 5RSN. Thanks, Alex.